This module is on mutually assured destruction and nuclear deterrence. As you will see in the syllabus, you need to buy and watch Dr. Strangelove, the movie, either rent it or buy it. Everything you need to know about nuclear deterrence is in Dr. Strangelove. I encourage you to watch it before this module, this video, as well as afterwards, because the assignment is on Strangelove. Now, nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence really is, assured destruction between two enemies. The question is, how do we succeed in a nuclear exchange? And the answer is quite obviously, it will be suicide for you to strike first against your enemy. In the Cold War, ICBMs, these are intercontinental ballistic missiles, they assured complete societal vulnerability, meaning both the Soviet Union and the United States had these long-range ballistic missiles which could take out most of American society, population, and a Soviet one. Looking at over the years, Secretary of Defense Schlesinger gave some more option. We need more than just suicide or surrender. Secretary of Defense Schlesinger made some changes in 1974, and there became more of a proportional response. That if we measure our response proportional to what the Soviets did, would be more believable than an all-out counterattack, which would have wiped out all of Soviet population. And therefore, the Soviets would realize that any sort of Soviet mischief attack would be retaliated against. Now, again, we have different watershed moments which showed you the genesis of nuclear deterrence. Of course, the first one was the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the Cold War, and also, starting the nuclear age. The hydrogen fission fusion bomb was the second watershed moment. The United States had it first in 1952, and the USSR a little later. This was basically a two-step. A trigger, a small fission, induces the fusion of atoms of heavy hydrogens. What this did was a lot more powerful, a lot more lethal, a lot more destructive than the bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As I mentioned just now, the ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles, were the perfect delivery device. So you have the nuclear weapon, but you need a missile in order to project it abroad to the US or to the Soviet Union. And that really meant that both American and Soviet populations were completely vulnerable to an all-out destructive attack by the opponent. You also had multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, MIRVs, which basically was a missile which had smaller nuclear missiles in it. The US got it in 1972, 5 years later the Soviets. Kissinger, cheeky as he was, managed to exclude it from the SALT talks, and that really was meant to, to give the United States, optimum trump card, in the sense that they might have reduced the number of missiles, but overall they still retained numerical superiority. Ballistic missile defense is another important variable in nuclear deterrence. It has not happened yet. It is to this day, a very, very problematic factor in Russian US and Russian NATO relations. Whichever country has a total ballistic missile defense is invincible. So the Star Wars initiative under Reagan was not attainable, both in terms of technology, in terms of money. It was, a formidable task, not attainable at the time. The idea was to have a ballistic missile defense in space, which would shoot down any incoming ballistic missile or submarine-launched ballistic missile from the Soviets. We have different forms of missile defense. You might have seen the THAAD missile defense system in South Korea, which the United States is in the process of installing just in 2017. We have different missile defense systems in Europe targeting Russian missiles. NATO said they're against the Iranians and North Koreans, but it's really meant mainly for the Russians. Now, how does nuclear deterrence work? So these were kind of the most important milestones. How does nuclear deterrence work? It really is a game of strategic interaction between two players. And these two players make a calculation: what would happen if they react? What would happen if they strike? And the consensus is here that the costs must be so little or the damage so high that not striking is the most preferable outcome for either of those. One of the main accounts on deterrence comes from Thomas Schelling, Arms and Influence, and that's sort of a kind of a playbook of how deterrence works. So a lot of credit goes to Schelling, who got the Nobel Prize for Economics actually on all of his work on game theory. And game theory itself really came of age during that time in political science, international relations, economics, and had other applications. But game theory in particular was important in the creation of nuclear assured destruction. And again, in the movie Strangelove, Strangelove embodies different people. He obviously, the mad scientist, the mad German scientist, but also not only physicists, but political scientists, economists, international relations scholars. All of these were really involved in creating and defining how deterrence worked. Now, in it, he provides that communication is key. In the movie, you see Dr. Strangelove scolding the Russian ambassador. Why didn't you tell the world? Why didn't you tell the world that you had this doomsday machine? So you must believe that you're committed to fight. Not only are you committed to fight, you are committed to fight and defend your allies. That is because you would obviously defend yourself, but you have to link it to defending your allies so everybody knows you mean business. Credibility and rationality. It's best to be believed to be a little crazy. Your threats are more credible, Schelling says, if you're not really that concerned about your own well-being. So again, irrational, something which is set to launch automatically. This automaticity, that is exactly the doomsday machine. There's the dead man hand, that switch, it will trigger, it will go off. If everybody is dead, it will be a machine which will retaliate against an attack by the Americans. That is the doomsday machine. So that is really putting yourself in a position where you cannot fail to react as you said you would. So it is automatic, it is out of our control. So this is the best form of deterrence, that you put yourself in that position. Nixon came up with that the madman theory, which really was very much what Schelling said, that he liked the fact, Nixon, that he was viewed as somewhat irrational and erratic. He thought that this would help him to settle his accounts with enemies and international actors on his own terms. Coupling capabilities to objectives, relinquishing the initiative. Now again, traditionally in military conflict, you want the initiative, you want the element of surprise. You don't want that in deterrence. The opposite, you burn your bridges, you burn your ships, you have only one option, and that option is to fight. That is deterrence. Looking at the United States putting 7,000 US troops in West Berlin during the Berlin crisis, these 7,000 forces could have easily been overrun by the Red Army, which was surrounding West Berlin. But the Soviets knew that by doing so, by killing US servicemen, they would retaliate and it would trigger a US response. To this day, this is still the case in South Korea and the DMZ, that you have several thousand US Marines, which are really human shields. They're the tripwire that if the North Koreans would invade the South, would go into the demilitarized zone into the South, the first ones they would have to kill would be US forces. And that is the most powerful deterrence somebody can have. That will be extended deterrence, that the United States is defending an ally over there in Southeast Asia by putting their own troops there. So again, you only have one option, and that option is to fight. Commitment. You incur commitment. That usually is done an alliance, a treaty. Any member of NATO under Article 5 is committed to come to the aid of any other member if that member would be attacked by a third party. That is collective security. So again, an alliance does that you put your nation's honor at stake. You United States legally, as a NATO member, has to come and help any other country, NATO member, being attacked. Independence of commitment. So if we let country X fall and being evaded, what does this mean to Y and Z? That, of course, was the sort of mindset with Vietnam. If we would let Vietnam fall to the communist, what does this mean for our containment doctrine globally? It turns out that Vietnam fell and it didn't really affect the global balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union, but that was the mindset at the time. Discrediting adversaries' commitments, that's sort of a trash talk that you see. You push the envelope, you try to weaken the credibility of your enemy, and don't treat them as serious commitments. Circumventing adversaries' commitments. So you say all commitments are really ambiguous by nature. So you kind of probe how far can you go. This is like in the car, two kids. They don't want to touch each other, or one kid is annoyed with the other kid, and that one kid says, "Well, I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you." That close to the face. So this is that. You see. Are you really bothered with us moving in that territory? Do you really, need that particular city? What if we annex that city? What if we actually take out that particular military force? So this is really seeing how far they can go, pushing the envelope, probe, and then you say, "Oh, I'm sorry, this was really by mistake. That was accidental." It is important to see the difference between deterrence and compellence. Deterrence is something you threaten that you will do. Compelling is you doing something, you punishing somebody in order for that person to retreat. So looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis, the quarantine or the embargo, that was a form of compellence. That they told the Soviets to stop. They had this embargo. The U.S. Navy put Cuba under quarantine, and any Soviet vessels coming in were not allowed to pass. Any form of sanction would, of course, also be a compellence. Any form of coercive diplomacy that can include, airstrikes or any form of military force could be a form of compellence. But of course, it has to be coupled to some sort of demand of what the other country ought to do or should stop doing if they're actually doing something which you want them to stop. So this is really comes down now to how does this nuclear deterrence work? That how do you threaten, you impose something which, if you did, that would immediately lead to suicide of the entire country. And the answer is brinksmanship. Brinksmanship is the art of manipulating the shared risk of war. You rock the boat. The metaphor used here is that you have two people in a boat, and if you want to force the other person to start paddling the boat, you start rocking, and you keep rocking the boat, and you force the other one to basically start paddling, because if they don't do that, the boat would capsize and both of you will drown. So this is brinksmanship, is rocking the boat, manipulating the shared risks of war. So this is what Schelling says: because neither state can physically protect itself from an adversary's attack, the probability of escalation to catastrophic levels of mutual destruction is always present in any crisis. Indeed, it is the essence of a crisis that participants are not fully in control of events. And that is the key here, that you're not fully in control of events. And that comes back to our movie Strangelove. It is out of our hand. It is up to the doomsday machine to decide. So we really mean business. We put our entire defense in the doomsday machine. Doomsday machine really represents all of these aspects, that we will leave something to a chance. We can't fully guarantee that if you attack us, that we will not retaliate. We will retaliate because it is out of our power. It is done up to the doomsday machine. So how does it work? So, a state may able to credibly threaten, actually engage in a process, a crisis, limited war, Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, that raises the risk that the situation will go out of control and escalate into full-blown nuclear exchange. Now, how much risk do you take? How do you retaliate? The higher the stakes, the more risk a state ought to credibly threaten to run. So again, during this crisis, you have the situation that states can exert coercive pressures on each other, taking steps that will raise the risk and at some point that could completely go out of control and end up in a nuclear exchange, which would be global nuclear holocaust. So because of that, no state really bids up the risk eagerly and with a lot of enthusiasm, because they're very, very careful. So again, you face this series of terrible choices throughout, and you're very, very careful in how much and how quickly you will try to escalate that conflict. So this is really that model that provides us how states can exert coercive pressure on one another. That of course only works if both have second strike capabilities, that they can absorb the first strike and they have enough material, enough resources to actually have a second strike against the other country. So this is a contest of resolve. You can see this is game theory. This is a game of chicken. It can spiral out of control at any point. If one of the states finds this risk intolerable high, they will start backing down, and that of course will be reciprocated by the other country. So this is a very short introduction to nuclear sure destruction. It really is meant to help you with Strangelove. So please watch this video before and after, preferably you watching Strangelove, and have fun doing the assignment on Strangelove.